first keynote speaker, Ken Peter, who's with the Crossroads Resource Center in Minnesota. Ken is certainly one of the most experienced food systems analysts in the U.S. at the present time, and he is well-versed in integrating market analysis, business development, systems thinking, and social concerns, which is not an easy task by any stretch. As president of the center in Minneapolis, Ken offers over 40 years' experience in helping to build inner city and rural community capacity. His Finding Food in Farm Country studies have promoted local food networks in 83 regions. Okay, so please everyone join with me in welcoming Ken to the Living and Working on the Land Conference.
I want to basically start by telling you how I think about this whole local food thing that's erupting around the country. A little bit about my background, but also why I do what I do and what issues kind of motivate me to keep doing this. And I do this on the advice of a farmer in Iowa who told me several years ago, you know, Ken, you should start out outlining your own assumptions so people can compare their own thinking with yours. And I think that's really sound advice. So that's what I try to do. And you may not agree with everything I say, but this is the language that I use and why I kind of put the concepts together I do, and that'll help us have a further discussion about that. Secondly, I want to show just a really quick highlight of some data that I pulled together for Sheridan County. I showed this last time I was here. It's not a very detailed data set because this is my commercial message. No one's hired me to do anything for Wyoming yet, but you know, we could do a more in-depth take, but just to give a little indication of some of the economics that I can see quickly without spending a lot of time, what's happening with farming and food here in the county. After that, I want to go on to some national stories to kind of show how that compares with nationally. And then finally, I will give you some examples of pretty cool activity around the United States that I think will be hopefully inspiring, giving you some ideas about, well, we could do something like that here. We could change that and make it our own. And that would be my hopefully that'll be very pleasing to you and maybe inspire discussions the rest of the day. I have to warn you, some of the economic data I have tends to be a little discouraging. And one person after hearing me speak said he thought I was on the perfect edge of absolute hopefulness and utter despair. And I think that's actually a fairly good critique of my speaking, but also it's really a situation where we are in our economy today. It's not, you know, I'm just showing you the data as the data shows the story. But I think we're in kind of a very interesting moment. This local food thing is happening at a very critical time for America, defining who we are as a society in some very new ways through food. So hopefully this will help us advance all that discussion. Actually, since I wrote the bio that John read, I've now visited about 24 other, or I've done studies in about 24 other regions around the country, and now up to 36 states. And I'm especially happy with some of these red circles here on the map because those represent people who had me do something with the 2007 census, and they came back and said, that was so valuable, we want you to do the 2012 census so we can see how we're changing over time. And what I mostly say about this map is, for those of you who sort of don't get out past Wyoming too often, this is a really good example of just how widespread the food movement is around the United States today. So many people in so many places doing very exciting work. For me, it's an incredible education because by traveling to most of these regions and to meet people like you and learn from your insights and what you're innovating here, I get a pretty rich sense of what's happening on the ground, and it really helps me keep going just to see the inspiring work and conversations that I get to be a part of. So I think this is a good track of both my education and also how strong this movement is erupting around the U.S. With that, I'd like to start with why I think it's important to do food work. And my first question is, what do we think a food system should accomplish? We're all eating pretty frequently. We all have economic transactions on that, but we often don't step back and say, what's really the purpose of the food system we're in the part of? What do we want to achieve by creating a stronger food system? My answer for that is four-part. I say basically we should build health, wealth, connection, and capacity in our regions. Regions like Sheridan County, regions like Northeast Wyoming, regions like Wyoming itself. I don't think it's any surprise for anyone in this room if I say food is closely connected to health. You probably understand very vividly from your own experience that eating well is the first line of defense we all have to stay healthy and hopefully keep away from the medical system until we really have to be there. So that's not a surprise for anybody. We're kind of talking about that and aware of that all the time. I think we also know, and those of you who are producers know this better than I do or anyone else, but if the system's not building wealth, especially for producers, it's not going to be sustainable over time. As Cole mentioned, some people might fail in their farm efforts. But if we don't have a way of really making sure that it builds wealth for people doing the work, something will be unstable. We have to find ways to make that happen. So the first two are no surprise. The third one, though, I think is not something we talk about very often. I go to many, many policy discussions where people don't even understand or recognize the importance of really connecting around food. If I were to have my family over for the holiday for Christmas, I would serve the foods, I have served the foods that my great-grandmother served off a wood stove in Michigan when she was a new immigrant from Europe. And she was serving the same foods that her grandmother would have served on a different wood stove in Europe before people came. And by putting that food on the table, I'm really saying, this is my place on the earth. These are my people. This is my culture, my heritage. And I'm really helping my family and my friends who come to me to eat participate in kind of perpetuating a tradition around food that's really critical. There's a reason we eat together instead of sitting in boxes by ourselves. It's really because that sense of connection and the conversations we have and the sort of understandings we develop eating together are really critical for society to cohere. And yet we have a lot of our food policy discussions without talking about that. So I think it's really important to bring those in and say, this is really about networking. It's about building connections, not simply how many dollars flow and not simply how much food is produced and eaten. I think once you look at the food system from that perspective, I think you get very different insights into it. Finally, we need the capacity to handle food safely and to handle food productively. If we'd had a meeting here in Sheridan 100 years ago, almost everyone in the room would have been farming, would have known a farmer. Many people in the room would have known how to take a pig from a whole animal to pork if need be. Today we have people working in inner city America who find that their clients don't buy pots or pans for their kitchens because they don't think that has anything to do with eating. People are so used to going to a fast food place, using a microwave and heating it up, and really have lost a lot of skills about, well, how do you handle food safely? How do you actually prepare meats and vegetables separately to keep from developing contamination? How do you do the basic sanitation stuff? We're actually in a very curious place where we have incredible bounty of food with all kinds of bells and whistles and pretty packaging, and we don't know food about ourselves. And we say we feed the world, but a lot of youth, and actually I spoke once at a planning conference in Alabama, and a woman ran out of the room as soon as I was done speaking. She came back later that evening and said, you know, I'm 45. I called my mother right after you were done speaking, and I said, Mom, I gotta learn how to cook. She's a professional woman, has a good salary, but she's never learned those skills. And it's a remarkable moment we're in where we're saying we feed the world, and yet this is also true. How do we kind of put this together into a better package for society that's really a little bit more about building these things in our communities? The data I will show you today will tend to indicate, it won't be proof today because we don't have that time, but we're failing in all four of these counts. We're building bad health outcomes at considerable public expense. We're building bad wealth outcomes where some people are making quite a bit of money where others are not within the food system itself. We're getting less connected around food than we used to be before. And as I said, I think we have less capacity to actually know about the productive skills about farming, of handling food than we would have had 100 years ago. If you think this is a vision for the future, we have some serious work to do, and you folks are doing that work right now, but we need a lot more people in this room next time we have a conference like this, where people are really, in a much broad way, saying, I'm doing part of the answer for this question. I think this is really a good direction to look at. The one economic insight I'd like to have you take home from this speech, if nothing else, is that the food system we have is very efficient at taking wealth out of our communities and putting it to someone else. And this is an uncomfortable fact. Some of the data will show this. A lot of people would prefer I don't talk about this because it's actually much more fun to have a conversation without recognizing this. But I also say that those people who kind of put this conversation aside tend to be the ones who recreate the same problem. They joke charging down the road saying we're going to build a local food system, and they often attach to the system that's taking money out of their back pocket, and they say, how come we're never getting ahead? I think it's important to understand this reality just so you can actually be strategic with it. It's not to say that it determines our lives, but if we understand that, we know how to be strategic and how to attach when it's in our interest to attach and detach when it's not. So I think this is also a really critical thing to think about. What we're calling local foods right now in the United States, I would argue, is the most important step we can take to build economic recovery in the United States, or economic development, if you prefer my saying that. I don't say this lightly, but we spend, as a society, $1.2 trillion a year buying food. That's 3 times the value of the Apple Corporation, which by all rights is a pretty interesting corporate entity. We, on a daily basis, an hourly basis, are making more decisions than the executives of Apple as a collective group. We're making more decisions about which farms survive, what's the future for our grandchildren, what's the health of our society going to be. Things we do in very small levels hourly add up to being quite big impacts. So I think it's really important to kind of recognize the power we have as consumers, the responsibility that puts on our shoulders, but also think about what power this allows us to really see for building a better future. What I would say is in a reality where money is being drawn out of our communities, one of the best ways to build networks that keep that money at home are to connect around doing food trade with local people and trading those dollars back and forth within the community. It doesn't take a big investment to do some of that, especially with things like some produce and some fruits. It's pretty straightforward. We all are involved. Another reason this is really important is that all of us in the society eat 3 times a day if we can afford to. And we can't simply say, gosh, Joe, you're out of the food system this month. I can't come to you and say, you know, I decided to opt out of the food system because I had a bad month last month and I'm not going to eat. Most would recognize that I'm kind of on a dangerous sign if I do that. I'm really kind of setting myself up for some health trouble or some other problems down the road. We're actually forced in food to make sure everybody has access to the best food available. And if we can't do that and build an economy around that fact with food, it'll be very hard to build that around windmills, around cars, around a different bank, a sort of more expansive financial system. I think these lessons we learn by the work you're doing are incredibly critical to the whole fabric of American society. We just happen to sort of be choosing to do it in food right now. And having been wanting this, as a person who's wanted this to happen for 40 years, I'm very thrilled that we're in this moment of defining and questioning and seeing what we can do. The final thing I'd like to say is that when I use the word local, for me it's a shorthand. I'm not going to say here, we had a good discussion at dinner last night with some folks in the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union about how do you define local? You know, it's not clearly about food miles, because you might say local food in Wyoming comes from Colorado. You might say it comes from Montana. And it's not simply a matter of how far it travels in a truck or a train. What I would argue is that what I mean by local food is really the quality of the community connections we build around our food trade. And if those community connections are strong, we will localize our food miles. You know, it's going to be more the outcome than the purpose of what we're doing. And if we build businesses that trade with each other and bring money into a community and also keep it there for a while and keep it cycling through different hands, different generations, we're going to find our food miles go down because that's sensible. As oil gets more and more expensive, we're going to find our food miles going down too. But if we're just buying from the closest producer, in my book, that's not going to be enough. I know some people who raise chickens I don't want to eat, and they're close to my house. But that's something that I choose not to do. And if I said I'm all about miles, I would almost force myself to buy from somebody I don't like, where I know there's somebody who's a little further away who's doing really the kind of food that I want to eat and the kind of processes I want to support. So for me, those connections are much more important than the number of miles. And it's in that spirit I kind of talk about local food. One reason I say this is if I titled my speech as How to Build Community-Based Food Systems, most of you would have stayed home today. But if I say local food, it kind of makes sense as a way of describing what we're trying to get done, because it's about that sense of locality and connection. So that's what I do. Here's some local blueberries to the city of Montreal that I got to visit at a market one time. Let me just show you an example of what I'm talking about when I talk about community-based food systems, or another term I have is a food web. A different term than the ecological term, but the web of relationships we build around trading food. This is a couple in northwest Indiana that started a farm. They started raising produce for themselves and their neighbors, and they were selling through a CSA, a community supported agriculture farm, and they had a good little clientele, and they said at some point, we cannot make enough money or work hard enough to make this a decent living to raise a family through the CSA alone. We have to do something else. And they decided that their strategy was to help 20 or 30 of their neighbors trade produce to local buyers who were trying to buy products for the local grocery store. Young couple starting out, they had a fire that destroyed their barn. They started rebuilding the barn, went ahead and did it anyway. Incredibly determined people who had a little bit of money, but mostly determination. And that's why I like the story, because they did this without being wealthy in the first place. Well, they started a thing called This Old Farm, which is a way of getting those farms together to trade local food. Last I checked in with them about 2 years ago, they were up to $1 million of sales after several years of organizing this effort. Well, how did they do that? They were lucky in some ways. They started this old farm with some aggregation of some local farmers, and they also, a local meat processor, a small one down the road, retired, and they bought that facility from him because they wanted to keep that in the community. And now they have $2.7 million of meat that they process for the local community. They hire people to do that while they're selling produce, but they've started actually two businesses that work together. So you actually have a business cluster owned by two firms, two people themselves that are trading with each other. The meat goes through this old farm to be sold to their members. They have 75 farms now, 35 produce farms, 30 livestock farms, and 10 artisanal products that they trade through this old farm. So if you are a subscriber, you get access to all those products. They have 21 employees as of 2 years ago, probably quite a few more by now. And then look at the cluster of activity around them. They have workers who buy from local stores and farms when they can. They have 3,000 consumers who subscribe to food through this network. Local restaurants that buy food from them. They have wholesalers selling to Chicago and Indianapolis that buy food at a wholesale level to distribute to their members. Local marketing agents, organic certifiers, they buy locally produced farm inputs. All of that activity is kind of sprung up and is now being channeled through these two businesses that wasn't there 10 years ago. And you could look at that as kind of a web of relationships that they have formed by simply saying, how do we get fresh food to our neighbors in the most efficient way possible? It's not a big theoretical step. It's just determination to say, how do we make this play out and make it happen? To me, that is a very good example of a food business cluster, food web, where basically you get started, you build a few organic relationships, you build more as you can, and as you get more strength, you have a much more complicated approach to what's going on. So that's what that's my theory. And I think some of you folks are doing that already here. I just don't know the stories. So if you tell me a good story, it might show up in my speech later on. But right now, I just want to put that out there as an example of how some people think about the process of what we're trying to do with local foods. With that in mind, let me show you a little quick data from Sheridan County. Again, nothing very deep here, but just to kind of hint at what's going on. Population in Sheridan County has kind of mirrored the population of the state of Wyoming for the last 40 years. A rise here, I suppose this represents the farm crisis time when people said there's no reason to stay in our county. People left because they stopped farming, or their kids decided to move away really fast because they couldn't see a future here. And it started coming back up around 2001 and has been rising pleasantly since then. So whatever's happening in Sheridan County in terms of population is very much mirroring the state of Wyoming as a whole. And personal income shows pretty much the same chart. I just decided not to show it because it's very much the same data. I have to admit this is a Colorado buffalo. Let me now show you the last 40 years of farming in Sheridan County. The orange line on this chart shows all the income all the farmers in the county made selling crops and livestock from 1969 to 2011. Rising sales, and a nice steady rise. Farmers have found new markets pretty steadily, and some good activity going on there. Unfortunately, if you look at the maroon line, which is how much it costs those farmers to produce those products, that's rising even faster. And you see very steady rise, and in the last few years, a remarkably big rise of expenses that's not matched by the revenue farmers are earning selling their products. This is mostly going to be the larger commodity farms in this chart. Most of you folks won't show up in this because those of you who are kind of doing smaller scale agriculture won't be big factors in this story. This is mostly a story of the larger farms here. If you subtract the maroon line from the orange line, you get the net cash income of farming, which I call the farm production balance. When that balance goes below zero, it means farmers are spending more producing their crops and livestock than they get from the market. Doesn't mean they're going out of business. That may mean that they have to rely heavily on off-farm income to pay their bills. It may mean that they have someone else out of the family helping, support that farm. But it does mean that the economics of farming are a little bit more shaky than we'd like to see. And as you can tell, from 1981 to the present, there's only been 2 years where the cash flow was positive for all the farms in the county.
Does that account for the subsidies?
This does not include subsidies. I have data about that. I'm not sure it's in this presentation, but you probably have the sense that subsidies are a more important source of farm income than farming itself.
Well, that's what it looks like with the commercial farmers.
Yeah, well, I think that's been typical, except the last couple of years when corn prices went up, that changed for a couple of years. But I think that's been my experience in many regions I've looked at. Yes.
Now, when did farm subsidies actually start? So when did we have to start using farm subsidies to support?
1933 was the first federal farm subsidy program, but they changed with every farm bill. So they've been going on for 80 years or so. I won't have that data for you today, but we could actually dig it out in my computer and maybe talk about it. Yeah, but this is without the subsidy. This is basically just the cash operation of farming itself. Yeah.
Isn't it true that 70 to 80% of the USDA budget is food stamps and welfare rather than actual subsidies to the farmer?
That's right. That's right. Yes, and in some again. In most of my studies, I compare farm subsidies with welfare payments for food stamps. I don't have that for Sheridan County because I haven't done the study yet, but that's a very interesting number to look at. Sometimes you actually find that farmers get more money than food stamp recipients in a given county, but it depends on what they're growing and what the subsidy regime is like.
Can you repeat what he said?
Oh, so yeah, there's a video being made. So the question was, if I phrase this properly, that isn't it true that about 70 or 80% of the USDA budget is really food stamps and nutrition programs and a whole panoply of things related to helping people buy food? And I think that's true. A lot of that 80% is salaries for people who administer the programs and make sure it's fair, and it's research under nutrition and other things like that instead of simply giving food handouts. But that's a very good thing to point out. So anyway, if you believe in a future of farming in Sheridan County, and I assume most of you might, we have some thinking to do, don't we? The folks who are working very hard and some folks who are multi-generational farmers here are in some jeopardy, and we need to think about how to support them better than we do. It may not be a matter of public programs, but it's just thinking about what do we do to make sure that we have farming, let alone local food farming, is a really interesting question. But I also want to say this is also, unfortunately, only one part of the story, because it turns out that inflation changes these numbers. If you look at the value of a dollar, what I earned in a dollar 40 years ago is worth $6 today, just because inflation has taken so much value out. So let me adjust the same data for inflation. And I think you find some actually very different patterns this way. You see, first of all, that actually crop income or crop and livestock income has actually lowered in the last 40 years. And think of all the new combines and tractors and technology we have today we didn't have 40 years ago. Despite that, we're actually getting less return. Expenses have stayed pretty much constant for the last 40 years. It's not that they're rising so fast that they're kind of at a steady state, but the income is declining. And as you look at this over time, you still have the same pattern of only 2 positive years since 1981. But basically, the losses seem a little bit bigger because back in 1973, Sheridan farmers earned $20 million of surplus in one single year. We haven't had that since 1973. We had that because we were trading grain for oil during the OPEC energy crisis. And it's been kind of going downhill since then. We're basically making most money when someone else has a problem that we can kind of solve internationally. We can ship them food. That's when farmers tend to make the most reliable money, but it doesn't really last because the structure is not there to sustain them. If overall, it turns out that farmers now are making $29 million less farming today than they did 40 years ago after doubling productivity. And it's a $370 million loss that the farmers have incurred since 1989. I use that year because it's kind of when the farm crisis was over and things had stabilized somewhat. And after all that, farmers leaving some farmers leaving the land, some bankruptcies, writing down our debt. After that, the county's lost $370 million farming. Moreover, there's other losses we could point to that I haven't measured yet, but a lot of farmers buy a lot of their inputs from outside Sheridan County. That tends to be money that goes away and doesn't come back. Most consumers are buying food that's not raised in Sheridan County. That tends to be money that goes and doesn't come back. So there's a potential for really pretty massive amounts of money fleeing Sheridan County. This is probably a more extreme case than many places I've studied. I can show you other counties that have a much more hopeful story, but the basic trend, as you'll see soon, is pretty much the same. Income from crops has been steady for 40 years once you adjust for inflation. Income from livestock is what's declining, and a lot of you have seen this story much more vividly than I, but as the margins on raising livestock have gone so low, and we've lost so many beef producers and other livestock producers because production's moved elsewhere, there's a real decline in the production, the number of farmers, and sales. Now, you asked about government subsidies, so this is the comparison of subsidies. The yellow line here is the government payments to farmers that have come in since 1969. Fairly steady, low level, not a lot of commodity crops being grown here, so it's not as big a factor in farm income as it would be if you had a lot of corn and a lot of soybeans. But an interesting amount of money, and certainly one of the highest sources of income we have, topped only by what the statisticians call farm-related income. So if I rent out myself as to do a custom combining for a neighbor, I call that farm-related income. It's not on my farm, but it's income that I earn from a farm-related activity. So that turns out to be the best source of income. In fact, a lot of this is cash rents. So as a lot of landowners have found out, you can make more money renting out your land to a farmer than farming it yourself. And again, that doesn't seem like a stable situation for farming to be in. I don't have the food stamp numbers for Sheridan County right now, but we could look those up sometime. Well, I guess the next thing I would say is that if farmers found a way to rely on local inputs the way that this old farm does, generating their own fertility. This is a farm in Ohio that takes the manure from its cattle and it collects it in a field and it mixes that together with old straw and hay that's gone bad, and they put some minerals in there and they create a very fertile compost that they can sell their neighbors to fertilize their fields, mostly produced in the county. The more we do that, the more some of the losses of buying farm inputs would be a little bit tempered, although we have a long way to go. I don't have the information for the market for food in Sheridan County, but I do have one quick statistic which I think is interesting. If everybody in this county bought $5 of food a week from some farm in the county, just that act, seems like a pretty simple thing to do, that would generate $7.6 million of new revenue. And when you're saying that farmers are losing $20 and $30 million, that's not going to replace all that, but it's an interesting amount of money. How do we think about supporting local farms by building that local food trade, and what part of that can we accomplish and what part of that do we have to do in some other way? Well, I want to, yes.
So I'm wondering why, like, that statement alone, why, like, the USDA wouldn't do like an advertisement to people, like, the people in the room actually probably buy a lot of local or probably local producers, but like the other people out there that always shop at Walmart are always, why you guys wouldn't advertise like that particular fact to get out to people.
Well, I don't work for the USDA now,
Right.
and I learned I learned a long time ago that I cannot speak for the USDA, but I think it's a good question to ask USDA, you know, and then there may be some people who can address that. But I think it's true that this fact in some counties, I've put this out in Montezuma County. I'll show you some stuff of that in Southwest Colorado, their version of this story, and that animated the whole campaign overnight. And I think it's a very kind of potent figure. We had a figure like this for the state of South Carolina when we did the South Carolina study, that if everybody in the state bought $5 worth of food from a South Carolina farm, it'd be $1.2 billion of new farm revenue, which is the size of the entire poultry industry in South Carolina, the largest sector of the farm economy. There's some very major impacts here, and this is a pretty simple way to express some of the power that this has. But ask USDA. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's so simple. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, and we'll see how this can kind of play out a little bit. Okay, with that in mind, I want to show you some national data too. I want to give you some sense that the story we saw in Sheridan County is unique, but also related to what we're going to see nationally. Here's the last 80 years of farming in the United States, and this does go back to when before farm programs were in existence at the federal level. Remarkable growth of markets, and every time farmers make a little more money, the input prices go up. So can someone show me sustained growth in agriculture in the United States in the last 80 years from this chart? This is a country that says we feed the world. And yet our farmers are pretty much at the same plane today, and we have a lot fewer farmers now than we had in 1929. Can we explain that? What happens if we adjust this for inflation? Some of the same things turn out. We see the peak was indeed in 1973 when we were selling grain to the Soviet Union in exchange for oil. Farm income has, you know, improved a little bit. This goes to 2011 as corn prices were starting to rise up to $5 and $6 a bushel. So we see some improvement here, but the input prices went up because farmers are spending money at that point. And we've actually had one peak in the post-war, during World War II when we were feeding soldiers, and after World War II when we loaned money to Europe to buy food from us because they were bombed out and couldn't produce their own. When that was gone, income declined. We have the oil peak, it declined again. This is the farm credit crisis, the 1980s. It's been kind of steady since then. What I really think is most shocking to me about this story is that net income for farming in 2011 was lower in 2011 than it had been in 1929. And 1929 was after 9 years of a farm depression that was a major cause of the Great Depression in the United States. So I think this data is kind of a wake-up call about what's going on with farming, and in a country that's become very productive in farming, but also not really rewarding rural communities very well. This limits the options you have to do the work you want to do to innovate on your farms and your households here today. This is the value of food that farm families have kept for themselves to eat for their own family budget. In 1950, that was a $20 billion industry. Farm families just reserving their own food for their own use and feeding themselves. And over time, they got persuaded that don't go out there and do that gardening, it's dirty work. Don't do all that time canning because that's kind of, you know, boring. Sell your commodities and go to the store and we'll have some really nice foods for you. So about 1973, the same time we had that oil crisis, farms kind of pretty much gave up in a lot of ways of at least reporting to the United States that they were saving food for themselves, but probably feeding themselves too. So we now have rural communities where people don't know how to garden. We have rural communities where farm families are depending on a store for food that they have raised themselves. Again, this to me makes me question this mantra we have that we feed the world. I would think in a country that fed the world, our farmers would feed themselves first. But that doesn't seem to be happening. Something else happened in 1973. Brief story. We traded grain to the Soviet Union because they had some crop failures. They had money in dollars in bank accounts. They bought the grain with dollars. We got our dollars back, which helped compensate for the money we were shipping to the Middle East to buy oil. I should add that oil rose dramatically in 1973 to the price of $40 a barrel in current dollars. And we were in a crisis. We had people waiting 3 hours in line at the gas station. That may not have happened here in Wyoming, but it happened in Minneapolis, where you weren't sure if you're going to be able to get to work, go to grandmother's house. $40 a barrel. And that led to a very big economic thing. Well, when that bubble burst, we had a bunch of corn we had raised because farmers had been told, we're going to find permanent markets abroad for you. They produced a lot of corn. It was stockpiled. It became very cheap to make one sweetener, which we now call high fructose corn sweetener. This was fueled by a chemical process that allowed an enzyme to make the sweetener more efficiently. The price of corn being so low made it a very sensible sweetener to adopt for the food industry. It's sold as a liquid, so it's a little easier to mix into some of the formula than granulated sugar. It became the sweetener of choice in a lot of ways. Our sugar use declined. Our overall sweetener use did not change much until 1990. It started going up, but this is fueled by a big change in high fructose corn sweetener. The next year, 1974, we started noticing our kids getting overweight. And as those kids got older, we noticed that adults in 1976 started becoming obese, now becoming the highest category of overweightness or obesity. So that decision we made to grow a lot of corn so we could feed the Soviet Union had some consequences on our kids' health. And that's an example of how complicated this food system can be, and why we want to be careful moving forward in the future that we do stuff in a very appropriate way to not have bad outcomes when we make certain decisions. But, and I also have to say, this is not just because of high fructose sweetener. It's also because we lose the one person at home cooking meals for the family and watching what kids are eating and cooking balanced meals and noticing when someone gets a little bit heavier. We have more people eating alone, more families not eating together. We have, one of my favorite theories that's unexplored is that we're raising animals to gain weight as fast as possible. We're eating them. Well, maybe that's related to our gaining weight ourselves. But we kind of get on this treadmill of saying we have to go faster, we have to go more and more and more, and we do that, and we end up being a situation where 2/3 of us are overweight or obese in this country. And it's related in some respects to our grain economy. And we have to kind of think about how that relationship is true and what we want to do about it. So I think that may be the end of the distressing news for the day. This greenhouse in urban Chicago is an example of people in a low-income neighborhood with some help from funds, grant funds, deciding to put up a hoop house and raising their own greens for use in the neighborhood. I think this is to sell to their neighbors. One of my favorite stories is about just kind of the importance of direct food sales, where a farmer sells directly to a household that wants to eat that food. And this is an old chart now, but it shows some of the growth of that sector between 1997 and 2002. And you will see, some areas of Wyoming show up fairly nicely in here. But a lot of increase in those sales in the West Coast, Pacific Northwest, a lot of increase in New England, quite a bit in Minnesota, Chicago. All the blue counties represent the places where in this period of time, farmers did the most to reach out and connect with a customer and say, wouldn't you like to buy food from me directly? And the consumer said, yep, I'd like to. If you look at the national data, some upsetting things have happened. It actually doubled from 1992 to 2007, and in the last census we found it kind of leveled off. I suspect that since this doesn't confirm with what I'm hearing from farmers about really finding good markets, this may be a fact that the census doesn't pick up the direct sales as well as it needs to give us good information to answer the question. It may also mean that, to some extent, farmers have said, I'm selling about as much as I can to my neighbors. I've got to find wholesale markets. I've got to find aggregators. There's a whole bunch of stuff I have to do differently beyond direct sales. Those are both possible ways of explaining this data. I don't think we know the answer to that now, but I think it's exciting that in 15 years it doubled. It's also exciting it's $1.4 billion worth of sales. $1.4 billion worth of sales a year. from farmers direct to customers. That's not a trivial amount of money at all. And that sale does the most to build those connections between neighbors that I talked about when I talked about building the food web. That's a very intimate way to do that. One of the things that gives me hope of eating in Minnesota in the future is this greenhouse that was built in a town called Milan, western Minnesota, not far from Highway 212. And I visited this greenhouse on a cold, blustery January day. It was 13 below zero wind chill when I got out of my car. And I actually had trouble standing up when I got out of the car because the wind was blowing so hard. This is a winter CSA farm that sells fresh produce from November to April every year. Then they let the thing go fallow in the summertime. They sell only within 30 miles of themselves. When I walked in the greenhouse, it's a little hard to see, but the temperature was 65 at sunset. And they said it had been up to 85 at 3 o'clock, and they opened the door for a while because they didn't want me to be too hot. Plexiglass, 2x6s. The sun burns down in this and heats the air. They have a fan that blows that warm air down below ground. When they built this greenhouse, they put in sand and gravel to kind of store that heat overnight. So on a daily basis, whatever the sun does, it generates new heat. It's stored below. At nighttime, that comes up to heat the crop and keep it from freezing. They put in a propane heater because they were sensible. They knew they couldn't always count on solar gain. And they said 2 years ago, they said, our total propane bill for heating the greenhouse through the entire winter in Minnesota was $100. Because that only kicks in when it falls below 45 degrees, and most of the time the system takes care of that. What's their growing medium? Organic soil inside a Home Depot gutter. And they said, we really want something that you can buy off the shelf. Nothing fancier, you have to reconfigure, you can just buy it, put it together. And I would say the mustard greens in this greenhouse look pretty happy and healthy. They're glistening, and it was really transformative to me to walk into a greenhouse when it was 13 below zero, take a taste of a fresh mustard green and say, I'm getting a flavor I don't normally associate with wintertime in Minnesota. A lot of people doing hoop houses here, I understand that. A lot of people doing hoop houses and greenhouses all over. But I like this for just being kind of a tightly designed thing that some folks did. They've now formed a network of people in western Minnesota who want to trade food with local neighbors in the wintertime through greenhouse production. So some simple steps people can take on their own. Pete Scherf is a businessman I met in Indiana about 4 years ago. And Pete had been, he owned a piece of land in rural Indiana, not too far from Chicago. And he was running a successful metal cutting business. He was cutting metal with lasers. And he said, I got to the point where I got invited and I built the gate for the White House. And I said, there's not much more of a challenge for me in this business than that. And he also said, I'm young, I'm getting kind of tired of the way people are, of hiring help who are not reliable and sort of worrying about employees. I'd like to work with the land that I own. So he spent 3 years as a successful businessman doing a planning process, bringing in the SBA, bringing in 3 lenders, and saying, how do I configure this the best possible way? He decided that he really liked the idea of raising cows. He thought he could really identify with the animals. And he has also said, my wife and I decided we wanted a farm we could run together without hiring labor except for emergency. We didn't want to worry about someone showing up. So we did a small farm that we could manage. If one of us is sick, the other one can do all the work for a day or two. Really simplify and hopefully have a better life. Well, they calculated in their 3-year business planning process that they raised 25 cows and bottled the milk themselves and sold it to neighbors, they could make more money than if they had 150 cows and they sold that as a commodity to the commodity stream. That's what they're doing. Now they're lucky, they're close to Chicago, they've got some people who drive by their farm and pick up milk and who have money to spend, and they have a few advantages that not every rural community has, but they decided to simplify and go small so they can make more money. This goes against our conventional thinking, and I think it's a really good example of how we're kind of rethinking a lot of our assumptions in the last few years. Organic food sales are rising in the same parts of the country that we saw in direct sales elsewhere. One of my heroes in organics is Organic Valley, which is a cooperative of cooperatives based in southwest Wisconsin. Actually, this building is partly destroyed by fire a couple of years ago. It's been being rebuilt, but this is a town of about 500 people in southwest Wisconsin. It's this corporate headquarters for a national company that's now selling $1 billion worth of products. And again, the story here is that even in a small town with a limited population, if you know the resources you have and if you think carefully about your markets and possibilities, you can grow an exciting business. People are traveling 3 hours a day to come to work because of some of the best jobs available. This is, they're projecting 2013 sales of $1 billion, but the last data I have is 880 million. After 25 years in business, starting with nothing. And in 1988, Organic Valley was 8 farmers in a living room in southwest Wisconsin saying, you know, the system isn't working for any of us. What are we going to do? And by asking those questions, building some trust together, building some sense of connection and some power struggles and some differences of opinion about where to go, they found some markets, they found some investment money, they tapped into a metropolitan market, not a local market. They're selling food to urban areas across the country, people who can pay high prices for organic milk and organic eggs and cheese and meat and some produce now. But they found a way to make a very interesting company happen as a cooperative of cooperatives engaging 1,600 members nationally. And compare that with what we saw in the chart for farming generally. It's a very dramatically different story. It shows that despite these kind of dismal economics, there's interesting stuff to do. Some of you may have met or heard about Will Allen, who's a former professional basketball player who grew up on a farm in Wisconsin near Milwaukee. And he decided to buy a greenhouse that was idle in suburban Milwaukee when he got out of his basketball career. And his first product was earthworms. He takes organic food scraps. Now the city of Milwaukee gives him dump trucks full of organic food scraps from their waste stream. And he feeds that to earthworms. The earthworms defecate, and he dries the pellets of that down to a very rich commercial scale fertilizer, which is produced by Hmong, Latino, and African American youth in urban Milwaukee, who then sell that to farmers in Wisconsin to sell at 100 acres at a time. Now, I would not have guessed 25 years ago that Milwaukee would be producing fertilizer for Wisconsin farmers, but it's been happening for a number of years there. Kids also work. This greenhouse is an old photograph, but tilapia fish inside this tank who eat some of the plants here. The plants also take nutrients out of the water, keep it clean for the fish. The manure from this fish is poured on these plants to help fertilize them. So you have kids learning ecological cycles, learning how to manage a business, learning how to sell products, learning marketing and so on, inside a system that's doing several $100,000 of sales per acre in urban Milwaukee. The secret there being close to markets, which a lot of farm people can't be as close to. Southwest Wisconsin also has a center that I really like, and I'm an advisor to this, Food Enterprise Center. This is a story of turning around what could have been a crisis and creating a much richer set of possibilities. This factory closed down precipitously in July of 2009. It was the only factory that had about 120 workers getting good pay in town of 4,000, town of Viroqua. And I had just done an economic analysis for this community and showed them some of the potential for food being an economic development vehicle. And suddenly this building became empty. It's 10,000 square feet. The head of the Economic Development Authority called up the CEO who made the decision to close the plant and said, "You've been here since 1974. We've been supporting you since then. How are you going to pay us back for taking now 85 of our best jobs out of town overnight?" The executive stammered for about 20 minutes. He wasn't sure what to do with this. He said, got worn down after a while and said, "What do you want me to do?" And she said, sell us the building, and he did for a very low price. So they now own, as an economic development authority, a 10,000 square foot building they're turning into a regional food enterprise center. And 100,000 square feet, excuse me, I got that factor of 10 wrong. But this is the model there. They have this organic food trading firm is no longer there because they have risen and decided to scale back. Fifth Season Cooperative is a cooperative of producers that are selling products together to wholesale markets like schools and hospitals in the area. An organic herbal product store. They have a new soda company coming in that's selling sodas using flavorings from local products like rhubarb and so on. Some nonprofits have their offices there. Meat processor across the road, a food co-op in town, which has an in a town of 4,000 has a membership of 9,000 and has a Frank Lloyd Wright design, style building design. Schools that are buying food from local farms, hospital that's buying food from local farms, organic valleys nearby with some technical assistance, Amish farmers who are ramping up organic production, which they didn't used to do because there's a market for that now. That's the food web in southwest Wisconsin, created not by intentionality, but by reacting to a crisis and saying, we don't want that building to go to some other purpose. We want to bring that into our food. And they've created a regional destination for organic food that sells food from St. Paul to Chicago. As a town of 4,000 people. Just by, again, working together well, building that trust and developing a different set of relationships than they had before. I'm going to skip over this just to save time, but there's a couple more stories I want to tell. I did a study for North Alabama for the food bank, and I think this is also a really interesting moment too, because we have this increasing problem of hunger in our country, and we have food stamp recipients, as you mentioned, sir. We have an interesting expanding problem of hunger at the same time we say we're feeding the world. And the food bank had a kind of wake-up moment after my study was done, where they said, we raised money from a foundation so we could buy vegetables for our recipients because we wanted them to eat more vegetables. We bought a shipment of canned peas. When we got the canned peas, we discovered they were produced in China. And they said, we're in probably the perfect area of Alabama to be raising peas here. We have a history of doing that. Why are we raising tough corporate donations to ship in peas from 11,000 miles away? What do we do about that? They can't solve this problem overnight, of course, but it kind of woke up the board to saying, we have to think about intervening in a different way as a food bank. And the idea was that they helped a guy who lived in a low-income neighborhood of Huntsville grow more food for his neighbors. They facilitated him getting access to a market stand that he could sell that product. And this guy basically borrows land from his neighbors, gives them food in exchange for using the land, and he sells what he can sell. They just kind of said, for someone who's already doing that, let's make it stronger. But their next step is to say, we want to be a food aggregation hub here. And their reasoning is this. They say, we already know all the growers in North Alabama who are trying to sell for local markets. We're the best place to go if you want to make contact with one of those farmers. So let's enjoy that status and use it. They're asking people to call them if they want some fresh produce. Call the food bank first. And the food bank will say, we'll connect you with that farmer, and the farmer can make whatever deal it wants to with you for what they want to sell at the price they want to sell it. You folks take it from there, but we're going to be the main contact point, and we're going to know what people are growing because we have a staff person traveling around and making those relationships and making sure we know what's happening. Their idea was to become a place, well, since they have coolers and warehouse space and trucks and they know how to handle food safely, they said, why aren't we the food hub for Huntsville, Alabama? And the main reason now is that they're a small food bank and they don't have the budget to carry that off. But they're saying, in the meantime, let's operate as a brokerage firm to help people make small deals to get fresh food into restaurants and grocers in Huntsville. And hopefully, many of those farmers also donate product to the food bank so the recipients get some of that product too. Sir?
Do those food banks take food stamps? Is that what they're doing?
This food bank actually gives handouts. This does not take food stamps because it's giving the food away. It basically tends to take donations of food from a food corporation that has a surplus or a farmer that has either a surplus, or some farmers actually raise an acre of food to give to the food bank to give away. But this is a place you can come, say, on a Wednesday afternoon and pick up a box of groceries that either you select or is given to you that gives you an emergency supply of food when you need more than the food stamps can give you. And there's a rising effort for food banking across the United States right now. But I think the exciting thing for me is this kind of idea that food banks are somehow saying, maybe we already are the food hubs. Maybe we're the place we should sort of form that activity. Next slide is going to come later, I hope. But I want to finish with the study I finished about December last year for the state of South Carolina, which put out an RFP, a request for proposals from vendors around the country, and they had eight applications. They said that ours was by far the most detailed application, so they hired us to do a statewide food system assessment of what was happening in South Carolina. And it's a really interesting moment because, as I learned, that the low country here now by the Atlantic Ocean has some islands where people can grow 4 crops a year They are exporting, well, I'm going to show you that in a minute. I'll go through the story more slowly. Here's all the sponsors for the study. One thing I liked about this project was it was not only 2 departments of the state, the Commerce and Agriculture, collaborating and each funding half of the study, but they got the Agribusiness Council, the Farm Bureau, Clemson Extension, the Bank of South Carolina, Farm Stewardship Alliance, and the Coastal Conservation League all on one table saying, how do we make plans together for the future of rural South Carolina? And to me, that sense of connection in the planning level gave me a lot of hope that good things would come out of this in the long term. It's still difficult. Same thing, we feed the world, but we don't feed ourselves. We don't know about food. We have kids growing up in South Carolina not learning about not knowing what vegetables are. They also are growing up without work skills, because some work skills you only really seem to get in our society by growing up on a farm and having that sense of very tangible labor that you do day in and day out. South Carolina is exporting tomatoes across the eastern seaboard all the way to Long Island. It's exporting really high quality peaches up and down the eastern seaboard and into the Midwest. 4 growing seasons a year. And what I learned when I interviewed people was we're importing 95% of our food. And I said, how could that be true? That's actually almost the same as you'd have in Wyoming or Alaska, a study I just completed as well. How can it be that you can have so much largesse in production but be importing 95% of what you eat? Well, it turns out that there are producers in Florida and North Carolina that are bigger, they have lower costs, that can ship food in that market very reliably. And so a lot of people who are selling under the South Carolina label are still trading product from Florida because it's bought from a local buyer. Well, I talked about you talked about the 5-a-day campaign, 5-a-week campaign. This is something that happened in Cortez, Colorado, down in Montezuma County, southwest Colorado. The calculation there was if everybody bought $5 worth of food a week from a local farm, it would produce $2 million of new farm revenue for the county. They put that into an Eat 5, Buy 5 campaign, which is eat 5 fruits and vegetables a day, buy $5 of food a week from a farmer. We'll have economic impacts, we'll have healthier people. It cost them $500 to put that poster together. As soon as they announced the campaign, 3 counties nearby said, we're going to do that too. We now have a 4-county area of Colorado with this kind of marketing slogan. And this is, I think when more locales do this, then the USDA will sort of say, oh, let's strengthen that, because they tend to wait for something to build for a national audience. But again, very simple first step of thinking about food differently. There's also a food hub in Charleston called Grow Food Carolina, which I love this business. It's a very kind of new entrepreneurial place. There's about 45 restaurants in Charleston, South Carolina that trade local food. They're building those connections with farmers to make that possible. Farm truck drops off product there, gets packed and put on pallets and delivered to restaurants. A building was donated by an investor who had an empty building and said, why don't you use it for my food hub? I won't need it for a few years. You can even fix it up and rent out space as an income stream. It's had about $2 million in donations. They have a business plan that says in 6 years we can be self-supporting with selling food. And they're doing all that hard work of connecting farmers and chefs and farmers and buyers in the community. So they're doing a really nice job of building networks. When I asked them what was needed the most, they said what we really need is for farmers to have the capacity on their farm to take the produce they buy and wash it, cool it quickly, put it in clamshells or some attractive packaging so we can get it out to our market. And they should put it on a pallet, and we can just come by and pick up a pallet of stuff and put it on our truck instead of us having to go out there and show them how to pack and working with them to get that load built up. So here's an ongoing food hub that's doing quite well, doing all the things the food hub's supposed to do, and they're saying our next step really has to be investing at the farm level so people have that capacity, not only to produce food for us, but also if they have that facility, they can choose who they want to sell to. They don't have to sell to us. They can they can sell directly to school. They can sell to their neighbors on a farm stand. It's really their choice, and if they have that choice, they'll be stronger in their financial transactions. So our map for the future of the food web in South Carolina was this. It was basically to say, here's Charleston, here's the existing food hub. There's some people who want to put up one in Florence. Unfortunately, mostly because a political leader wants to have a building he can point to. Columbia has talked about a food hub of its own. That's still kind of on the back burner. Greenville, Spartanburg, people have been working for several years to come up with a plan for a food hub. But we said if you don't invest in these food production nodes, these yellow dots, the hubs won't have enough product to survive. Right now, Grow Food Carolina in Charleston doesn't have enough product to meet their goals of being self-sufficient in 6 years. They need more people producing more products, delivering it to them in a more efficient way. So this map turned the tide of one of our key members of the coalition. He said, that's the future of food and agriculture. And a legislator stood up at a conference and said, this is the future vision for what we want to do in South Carolina. Building a web of relationships that starts at the farm level but also goes up to the consumer level. Our model was to take 30 acres of land there's actually quite a bit of land that's not underutilized in South Carolina right now. Take 5 acres of that, make a training farm, 5-acre parcels where someone can grow a business, learn how to do marketing, learn how to do production better, using a common packing area right there. And we had a designer in Minnesota, adaptive plan he was working on for a farmer in Minnesota. And it basically calls for a staging area, offices for the farms, restroom facilities, kitchen, commercially certified kitchens so they can actually do light processing, make their own jams and jellies or whatever they might want to do. A shipping, receiving area, and washing and cooling and cold storage areas as well. The total cost of this, if you had a bare piece of land that was not polluted, would be $350,000. It's not terribly expensive, and if you invest at that level, 6 farms learn how to work together around that facility. 6 farms learn that they have reason to stay loyal to local markets, and people start building a different relationship than if they're just putting food on a truck that goes a long distance. So we're now waiting to see what South Carolina will do with this plan. I think that they announced it a year ago in December. There's an election there this year in November, so the Ag Commissioner is playing fairly cautiously because he wants to get reelected. But he has said that once he's reelected, he will allocate money in his budget to put this plan forward. And we've had legislators say, we finally have a roadmap for the future in the state. So hopefully they will know what to do with that roadmap. And I think Cole talked about roadmaps in the beginning here. That's the South Carolina roadmap. That's all I want to say for today. Thank you very much for looking at depressing news about the economy and kind of staying with me to some of the possible solutions.